Welcome back to another episode of the Marketing Stuff Podcast, where we're helping you learn marketing in a way that is simplified and easy to understand. On today's show, we're going to be talking about market research and give you the key elements that you need to understand in order to wrap your mind around this idea and be able to apply it as you are learning and developing your marketing. Let's jump into it. How are regular folks like you and I that aren't blessed with massive marketing budgets supposed to compete in spaces that take a ton of money, a ton of time, and a ton of resources, all while trying to stay sane? That's the question. And on this podcast, we're here to help you find answers. Welcome to the Marketing Stuff Podcast. All right, so we have a few key objectives for this episode today. We're going to talk about the 5 steps in market research. We're going to describe the various secondary data sources. We're going to get into some primary data collection, talk about some advantages and disadvantages of each. I'm going to do a light overview of the 5 V's of big data, very light. And then we're going to get into like the ethics of using your customer information. So the objective today is to make sure that you have a foundational understanding of the key components of marketing research so that you can dive into it. The reason why this is so important for you as a marketing professional is that doing marketing research well will give you the foundations that you need to do everything else. So let's talk about the 5 steps to market research. So step 1, we have to define the objective of your research needs. Too often as marketing professionals or new marketing professionals, we jump into doing the thing. We jump into creating the post, we jump into writing the blog, we jump into creating the video, but we haven't done the research yet. And I am guilty of this. So I'm not going to, this is not me chastising anyone. This is just the reality that if we don't define the objectives first, we will oftentimes go down the wrong path. Step 2, we have to design the research. So now that we know what we need to figure out the best way for us to go about in getting the information. By figuring out exactly what we need, we can figure out how much or how little information we actually need to go through. Let me give you an example. If I want to know if putting a coffee shop in my neighborhood is going to be profitable or not, I can look at third-party data sources, right? I can see how people are engaging with coffee shops. I can look for reviews. I can look for history of businesses in the area. I can use sources that are going to, and we'll talk about secondary data here in a bit, but I can use a lot of secondary data sources to determine if I want to really invest in that opportunity. However, if I want to ask a question that no one's ever asked before, then secondary data sources probably are not going to work. And so by looking at that, I know the research is probably going to take longer and it's going to cost more. Okay. Then we have to go through the process of actually collecting the data. This process is so much more significant than oftentimes I think we give it credit. Depending on how we go about collecting the data, will make it either useful or useless. And so being mindful of your data collection process is important as a marketing professional. Let me give you an example. If you go to your mother right now, and I'm stealing an example from a book called The Mom Test, but if you go to your mom right now and you ask her, hey, I'm thinking about starting a business. Is it a good idea? More likely than not, you are going to get a biased answer and she's going to say, yep, because she loves you and she doesn't want to hurt your feelings. And if you're curious about the mom test, go check it out. It's one of the most succinct ways that I have seen in figuring out how to go about collecting data. And then we have to review the data and develop our insights. So as we've collected data from secondary sources, we have done surveys, we've done phone calls, whatever have you, we just have mounds of information. Or let me be more specific, and we'll talk about why that matters here later on. We have mounds of data that we need to comb through in order to develop insights and to pull out information. This process takes time. The thing about market research, and I will say this over and over again, it is probably the least sexy thing that you're going to do in your marketing career.
Oh, so nobody here thinks power is sexy.
But it is probably one of the most important things. So this is why I went back and corrected myself on that language. Data, raw numbers, or facts. Information, organized, analyzed, and interpreted data that offers value to marketers, right? So I said, hey, you got mounds of information. That's not true. You have mounds of data that you're going to sort through to turn into a stack of insights. Okay. Then we need to develop and implement an action plan. So we have the data, we've done the research, we've analyzed and turned it into information. What are we actually going to do with it? And how do we do that? So after we've developed our implementation and action plan, we can actually move on to the next thing that we need to do. So usually we're going to do data research to determine if the course of action that we thought was correct. This information will help us validate if we're going to take our next steps. So let's talk about the different data sources that you have, right? So I talked about you can collect data. The one that I typically start with is going to be your secondary data sources. So the reason for this is because most of the time, especially if you are a small business owner, or you're in an industry that's been around for a while, the questions you are asking are not unique. I know everybody's special,
I agree.
but the questions that we're asking are not that unique. And so oftentimes we can get away with validating if our ideas are sound through secondary data sources. And we want to do that because they tend to be less expensive and quicker to implement. And I'm getting a bit ahead of myself sharing some of the advantages and disadvantages of secondary data, but that's key here. That's why we start with secondary data first. So some secondary data sources is you have what the book calls inexpensive secondary data source. So this is stuff that is widely available. I think of this like if you're in the US, we have the census. That would be an inexpensive secondary data source. There are some like public records, inexpensive secondary data. Google reviews, Facebook posts. I would consider these inexpensive secondary data because they are widely available at little or no cost. Then we have syndicated data. This is often available for a fee from a commercial research firm, such as Information Resources, NDP Group, or Nielsen. Another syndicated data might be like Data Axle or Data Resource, I think is what it's called. These are places where you can find bits of information that are available to you. They're typically available to a wide audience, but the cost is prohibitive. I think about Statista.com. One of their reports, oftentimes like $500. It's not that the report is not readily available to everyone, is that everyone is not going to pay $500 for the information inside the report. So it makes that information more restricted. Then we have scanner data. So this is syndicated information from your UPCs. So on the back of these, right, anytime you buy something, that scanner data gets collected somewhere. And that information can be utilized as secondary data source. Then we have panel data, information collected from groups of consumers. The reason why we have this in secondary data is because this was not collected by you and is oftentimes was not originally designed for your purposes. So when we think about secondary data, this is information that's already been collected and not necessarily collected for the purposes in which you intend to use it for. That is one of the downsides of secondary data. Hey, Maurice here. Different Maurice than from the show that you're watching right now. If you want access to all the resources that I'm talking about and you don't want to have to write them down, in the notes below, you'll find a link. If you register there, I have included all the resources that I talk about inside of this free database. It's yours. So get back to the show. I hope you enjoy. Okay, then we have some primary data. We have our qualitative, quantitative. I don't necessarily agree with the breakdown of this, but this graph comes from McGrath-Hill. I think it does a really good job breaking up the sections. There's definitely a little more nuance here than what's here, right? Especially when we look here, quantitative research, surveys, not always quantitative, right? So when we think about quantitative, typically quantitative is binary in nature. It can be grouped. Right? It's yes or no. It's ones or twos. There's something about it that you can group into clusters. Let's just go, it can be grouped, right? I don't want to make this overly confusing. Male, female, quantitative. Age, quantitative. Political affiliation, quantitative, right? No matter how many versions there are, there's really only so many answers that you can give. Whereas when you talk about, I don't love that panel is in quantitative. That's kind of qualitative. Someone on a survey could say, well, I like jeans because they make me feel good. Somebody else could say, I like jeans because they make me feel bad. Another person could say, I don't like jeans, right? So there's not a necessary amount of buckets that you're going to put a person in. So I want to highlight that, but you can get different bits of each type of information from each one of these sources. So you can do an in-depth interview and pull out quantitative information, but you can also pull out qualitative information. So while the types that they have are fantastic, I don't think clumping them into groups based on the technique is the most accurate way to do that. So let's see an observation. You really are watching something happen. You're reviewing, and typically it's in a way where the observer isn't watching you, watch them. In-depth interviews is typically going to be one-on-one. You're getting a chance to talk to someone, find out information about them, ask them detailed questions, and typically in an intimate setting. Then you have your focus group interviews. This is multiple people. There's usually a surveyor or two. Best practice in most of these is to have anywhere from 2 to 3 surveyors, one to write, one to question, and one to watch, right? Just best practice. And then we have surveys, so systematic meanings, right? We're collecting information using some sort of questionnaire. In-depth interview, focus group, survey, scanner. We talked about scanner experiments. These are tests that you can run, okay? So there is the opportunity to put people into multiple situations and see how they respond. So if I want to know if my new phone is easy to use, I may go out and hand the phone to 20 people and not tell them anything except for giving them an objective. So I want you to be able to send a text and schedule a text. And I don't give you any information. My goal is to make my phone intuitive so I don't have to provide the information. If 9 or 10 out of 12 struggle to do what I'm asking them to, it just let me know that my phone is not intuitive as I believe. So all right, let's scroll down here. Advantages and disadvantages of secondary and primary research. Secondary research, save time, cost less. All right, we talked about that a little bit. Disadvantages may not fit your needs. The data may be biased. Listen, most data is biased. We just have to understand the collection process, or most data has some inherent bias in it. We have to understand the collection process and know to what level that inherent bias may exist, and if we believe that's going to impact us or not. And if you have some feelings about that statement I just said, drop a comment below. I'd love to have that conversation with you. Primary research, custom, right? You get a chance to decide the questions that you're asking, the method that you're going to use. The disadvantage is it costs a lot, or it can cost a lot, and it can be very time consuming. Another disadvantage that I don't have listed here is like, if you're not a trained researcher or you're not mindful in your research process, the data you may get may actually be more hurtful than helpful.
That doesn't even rhyme.
Yeah, it does.
I've had entrepreneurs that I've worked with in the past say they went out and surveyed their customers and asked them what they wanted. And when they got the data back, it suggested that they wanted a bigger package size or they wanted more options. But when they presented them the bigger package size and the more options, they didn't buy it. And it wasn't until later that they realized what they were really struggling with was a different problem that wasn't articulated. It wasn't articulated because the entrepreneur didn't ask the right set of questions. So you have to be careful here when you're designing your research. All right, so again, we're going to do a high level here, the 5 V's. Big data are data sets that are really large or complex, typically multimedia. So not just one type. It can be video, audio, text, numeric, characters, doesn't matter. It's all intermixed. So you have volume, variety, velocity, veracity, and volume. And if you're curious about this and you want access to this document, go to mauriceadavis.com/vault, and you can get access to this and go through this a little bit more. Again, this is not overview of big data. So it's in there because it's important and it's something that you will run into as you are collecting data, but this is not a video on big data. Then finally, we got to talk about the ethics of using customer information. So as technology continues to progress, we have to be mindful that many ethical issues are going to arise, and just be careful with the way that you are applying the use of customer data, and that it is clear when you are collecting the information what you intend to use it for. So one of my favorite data collection tools is Disney's Magic Bands. Disney's Magic Bands collect a ton of information about the consumer. They inherently have tracking capability around the park, which can be tied, like if I can track you and I also have your card information, I'm gaining a ton of information about that customer through the use of multiple data collection mediums. Depending on how we use that information, it can be unethical. There's also conversation around these Disney bands as to whether or not they collect biometric information. Do they measure heart rate? And even if they don't, could they easily be equipped to measure heart rate? And if they do, what does Disney do with that information, right? Because now they own your biometric signature, which is like your heartbeat, your temperature, your skin, stuff like that, that they can use in order to determine your level of excitement in different areas of the park. So just some things to be mindful of, and be careful when you are collecting your customers' information, because different types of information also opens you up to a different level of scrutiny. So we think about the Disney Magic Bands. Let's say they were collecting your name, age, your heartbeat, your excitement in the parks, and then somehow, we're also collecting your gender and all these other bits of information. We may say that they now have a medical profile of you. And should they be required to store that information the same way your doctor does? So these are questions that happen when you get into data collection, when you're collecting too much information. So here's my final warning to anybody that's doing any type of data research, any type of market research when collecting information. If you're not going to use it, don't collect it. That's all I got for you. Stay out here, one of y'all.